Hello and welcome back. In this video I'm going to step through using a number of my favourite filters and tools in Photoshop, as well as some third-party plugins to take a fairly ordinary looking image into something worthy of hanging on your wall. So let's dive in and get started. For context in looking at this image I'm going to process, here are a few images from the similar location, and these were all taken a few years ago on a trip we did to Greenland, and that included a trip down Scoresby Sound, which is the largest fjord system in the world, and to a place called Red Island, which is where these photographs are taken. And as you can see here, the area is absolutely full of huge icebergs, and I wanted to capture a photograph that not only showed the extent of the icebergs but also gave a sense of human scale. And you can see here there are some people way down at the other end of the island looking over the scene, and I wanted to use something like that as the basis for my photograph. And here is the image that I decided to process and turn into my completed image. So let's firstly look at the processing in Lightroom, and then we'll move on into Photoshop. So here we are in the Develop module of Lightroom, and I'll just show you quickly the processing that was done in Lightroom, and it was fairly minimal here. Firstly, I'd made some slight adjustments to the white balance and the tint just to give it a little bit more of a naturalistic feel. As captured, it was a little bit too blue, and I made some adjustments to the exposure contrast, brought up the shadows, pulled down some of the whites, and added a little bit of texture and vibrance. And you'll see here from the histogram that I'm still comfortably clear of the clipping the highlights, although there's not a lot of detail showing in some of these parts of the icebergs. And the other most important thing to do here is to look at removing any chromatic aberration and profile corrections. This was taken with a 300mm lens that has a little bit of an issue with chromatic aberrations at the edges, so I adjusted those before taking them into Photoshop. So let's now open this image in Photoshop and work from there. So here we are with the image opened in Photoshop, and we need to do a number of things to get this image to where we want it to be. And the first things we need to consider is that this was taken under fairly hazy conditions with a long lens, a 300mm lens, and there was a lot of atmospheric haze and mist there that added to the softness of the image. And you can see here that it was photographed at 800 ISO, and so we've got a fair bit of noise in the image. Now we're zoomed into nearly 200% here, but you can see that there's quite a lot of noise. And for demonstration purposes, I'm going to make a duplicate of the background layer and apply the denoise and sharpening so that we can see the difference. And what we will do, we'll go into one of my favorite pieces of software, which is Topaz Denoise, and we access that if it's installed and you've bought it from Topaz. You'll go into via Filters, Topaz Labs, Topaz Denoise AI, and it will open the Topaz filter. And because I've already worked on this earlier, I know which of the particular models will work best on this one, but you've got a standard option, an option called Clear, Low Light, Severe Noise, and Raw. Now, even though this was a raw image, I found that taking it into Photoshop and using the Severe Noise option gave me the best results. And on the left hand side is the unprocessed version, on the right hand side is the processed version. If we look carefully at the people in this part of the image, you can see that the really crunchy noise is pretty much all but gone, and some of this rather nasty noise in the shadow areas around this iceberg is also being cleared up. Now at this point I'm not interested in sharpening, I'm purely only looking at getting rid of the noise. So with severe noise is the option, I'm selecting that, I'm going to apply that, and depending on how fast your computer processor works, it may take up to a couple of minutes to process, and so we'll let this finish processing and then pop back into Photoshop. So here we are back in Photoshop, and Denoise has finished processing, and looking at the image full size on screen, it's really difficult to see much difference. So we really need to zoom in and take a closer look. So let's just do that. Let's just zoom into 100% or 50% will probably be sufficient. Here is our people in the foreground. If I turn this layer off, a bit hard to see, so let's go into 100%. You'll see that there's a dramatic difference in the noise on the image. But we're not finished yet. We need to bring out some more of the finer detail in this image, and so on this particular layer that I've already applied the denoise to, I'm going to go into another one of Topaz's filters and use the Sharpen AI filter to bring out more detail. So let's do that now. So going back into filters, Topaz Labs, Topaz Sharpen AI, and again, because I've already processed this image, I know that the filter I want to use is going to be one of the various models that they have available. And so here we are back into Topaz Sharpen AI. By default, it always gives you a view at 100% in the center, but because we're really interested in these people here, I'm going to move it down to there, and it will regenerate the preview. So you need to just wait until it completes regenerating the preview, and you can see here on the left again the unprocessed part of the image, on the right massive difference in bringing out fine details such as the creases in the people's jackets and some of the finer details. And there are a number of different models that you can view from here, or you can let it choose automatically. By experimentation, I found that in this one there was a little bit of movement inherent in the image because I was using a long lens handheld, and because of that blurriness introduced by the haze, this was the model that worked for this one, but for other images it will be slightly different. And again, you need to look at maybe one of the comparison views where you can look at 4-up views to compare the different options. And if you look at this, it will generate a preview using 4 of the available options, and you can then select from the ones that you think work best. And Too Soft Very Blurry was quite good, but it did introduce a few little halos around the edges, bearing in mind that we are looking at 100%. And the Motion Blur Very Noisy wasn't bad, but again, I think that as it generates the previews for each one, we came back to out of focus. Or Motion Blur Very Blurry was the one that I think I've decided on. Each of these has their merits for different uses, but you need to decide based on looking at a comparison or a bit of experience which one works for you. Motion Blur Very Blurry, let's just go back to that split screen preview. It will regenerate the preview again, and you can have a look at it. The main thing here is to try and avoid too many unwanted artifacts. There are a couple of very slight little artifacts around the top of this person's head, but basically it's brought out an incredible amount of detail in that background. If you look at the underside of this part of this glacier iceberg, it was just lost in the haze, and it's really enhanced that, bearing in mind that we are looking at 100%. So let's go ahead and apply that, and we'll let this one process through and pop back into Photoshop. Sharpen AI does often take a little bit more processing time, but again, the results are well worth it. So here we are back in Photoshop after finishing the processing of the Sharpen AI. So let's just zoom in and get to a 100% view. This is with Sharpen AI and the denoise applied, and if we go back to our base image, you can see there's a lot of noise in these shadow areas. It's a little bit soft all the way through, and nothing looks particularly sharp. And yet when we apply those two filters, all of a sudden it makes a massive difference. Now again, bearing in mind we're looking at 100%, if we go back to fit on the screen, you're not going to see a dramatic difference at this size, but you will once you look at the image and we go further with the processing. You'll see a massive difference, and using these tools as a starting off point with any of these images is well worth the effort. This photograph was taken with a 36 megapixel camera, and so if we're going to print this image, we're going to be downsampling the image slightly for printing even at A2 size. So a little bit of artifacts around those edges is not going to be noticeable. But what I wanted to do now was that there's not much detail apparent in these parts of the icebergs that were lighter. Now we knew that they're not overexposed because the histogram showed us that we had plenty of coverage, but because it was a fairly soft day, we've lost a little bit of that information and it's just not apparent. And a great way to do that is to use the Nik Silver Efex Pro as a plug-in, using that to remap the tonal areas of the image. So with that background copy, which is our denoise and sharpen. So let's just rename that denoise plus sharp for the purposes of the exercise. With this active, if we can go then into our Nik Color Efex Pro, in fact we're going to go into Silver Efex Pro, and we're going to use that to remap the tonal range and bring out some of the fine detail. And this is one of my favorite techniques. I use this a lot, and under my favorites, if I select High Structure Harsh and look at the preview, you'll see that it's bringing out a lot of detail here and a lot of detail in the iceberg, but obviously it's giving me a monochrome preview. We're working with a color image. We're going to fix that later on, and also this is a little bit overdone, but we'll fix that once we apply it. So we'll click on this to apply the Silver Efex Pro as a new layer on our image, and here it is. It processes fairly quickly, but of course it's turned the image into monochrome. So what do? We change our blend mode from normal to luminosity, and you'll see that it's brought us back to a color image, but we've lost a little of the vibrancy, and at full strength it's a little bit too much, and so we would drop this down, and I normally work on 50% or less opacity, and you can see when I turn this off and on how much mid-tone contrast it adds, particularly here, but also brings out a little more on that part of the image. So I'm going to stick with that, maybe just a fraction less. And now we're starting to get the image coming to life. We've got a sharp image, we've got a good tonal range, and now we can work on the enhancements. So now that we've got the tonal range of the image and the detail sorted out, it's time to have a look at this and make some critical evaluations. Now, looking at this, I've decided that I really don't want these two people in the image. This is my focus of attention, this small group of people, so we're going to get rid of these people. Now, a simple way to do that is to use the Content Aware Fill option, and to do that we will just use the lasso tool, draw a fairly tight line around them, and use the Content Aware Fill and the power of Photoshop to get rid of these unwanted people. Now, keeping it fairly tight allows Photoshop to work its magic with the surrounding detail, and I just increase that a little bit. And then if we go to Edit Content Aware Fill, it should open up the window. But there's a problem. Because I'm working on a layer that's only got low opacity, which is that Silver Efex Pro layer, it's not going to give me a result that I want. So let's just cancel out of that. We've got those selected. What I really need to do is to make a new composite layer to use to make the Content Aware Fill work properly. So to do that, we use the shortcut Control Alt Shift and E, or Command Alt Shift and E, create a new composite layer that we now have this selection applied to. And if we go back into Edit Content Aware Fill, Photoshop will work its magic. Now we've got two people here that we want to get rid of, and you'll see here that it's sampling from some areas we don't really want it to sample from. I don't need that glacier as part of the sample, and you can play around until you get a result that looks pretty good. And if we look at this side here, we can zoom in and see that this person here is not giving us a perfect result. It's a little bit of a smudgy result here, but if I look at the other person over here, the result's not too bad at all. We can play around a little more with illuminating areas of the background to sample from, to try and keep it simple. And as long as we are sampling from areas as close to the original area as possible, you'll get a much better result. That looks a lot better now. Let's just say OK, and we'll go back in, and because these areas are still highlighted, you can see that if I then go in and deselect, this area is pretty much okay, this area is not so great. So we can fix that up with a little bit of cloning. So what I have here is this separate layer with the Content Aware Fill, and then the composite layer below. So if I now merge those two layers together, hold down the Shift key, and then just say, or click on Merge Layers, we've now got a composite layer that has all of that together, and we can then use our clone tool to fix up any of those areas that are not quite right. So let's just have a look at, firstly, where this person disappeared from looks pretty good, but there's a little bit of a blurriness there, and if we're very particular, we can just clone a few bits in here to just improve it slightly. I would just continue those little bits of ripples through the image a little further. The rest of that looks pretty good to me. This part is not so great though, because it's left a bit of a fuzzy edge, and what I want to do is I want to use part of this other part of the glacier to create a false edge there. So by moving my cursor over to this part, hold down the Alt key, using that as my source point, and then painting in, I can then bring this down and fill in those areas pretty well. You'll see that that now merges quite nicely, but I've still got a slightly funny edge there, so we can come back and repair that. Let's just move this up a little bit. Holding down the space bar changes the cursor to a hand, allows you to reposition within the frame, and again we're just going to use some of this existing area of water to just come in a little bit tighter and smooth those out. And just depending on how particular you are, you can spend a little bit more time getting this to look just right. But if we zoom back and use our magnifier to fit the screen, it's pretty near impossible to see where they disappeared from, but there you have quite a good result with those people taken out of the image. So now let's move on to a couple of more techniques where we'll finalize the image and get it ready for printing. Now we've just got a couple of more steps to make before we've got this image ready to go, but one of the important things is that I decided that these people here were the most important part to give scale to the photograph, but they're a little bit dark, so we want to lighten them, and the easy way to do that is to use the new tools in Photoshop and called the Object Selection tool, and this works incredibly well. Just draw a rectangle around the bits you want to select, and Photoshop will grind away and make the selection for you. And you'll see here that it's pretty near perfect. It's not 100% perfect, but it's done a very good job. And to amend that, I'll just change that tool to the Quick Selection tool. I want to remove a couple of areas from that selection, so I'll just use the minus selection tool, and you'll see here that it works pretty well. It will eliminate those areas. And I just really want to isolate this to the people on their own, and we'll just massage that just a little bit more. We are talking about fairly small areas of the image, but it's made a very good selection of that. So what we want to do with that area selected, I want to lighten those people. So quite simply, we'll just go to a curves layer. The selection appears on the curves layer automatically, and we're just going to use this to lighten these people a bit, gives them a little bit more lightness. Now, one thing you need to watch when you start to do this is if you lighten too much, you lose contrast. So by lightening the middle of the curve, I'm going to just pull down the darker parts just a fraction so that we don't lose too much contrast, and I think that's more than enough. So now we have these people that are a little bit more prominent in the frame, and that's looking pretty good. So there's just a couple of last few little adjustments we're going to make, and we'll move on to those next. So we're getting pretty close to having the image finalized now, but I want to make a couple of further slight adjustments to this image, and I like to add a little bit of color contrast, and for that we'll use the Color Efex Pro series of plugins from Nik, and again this adds a little bit of mid-tone contrast and also boosts a little bit of color saturation. Now, you could probably do this using just a hue saturation layer, but this does a really good job. And we have tonal contrast as the option selected. We have a preview left and right, and you can see that it does bring in a little bit more of that mid-tone contrast. I've reduced this to about 50% opacity. At full strength it can get a little bit too strong, and you'll see that it starts to bring out some of this mistiness in the sky, which was a bit of rain or snow. So I'm just going to drop that back to about 50% opacity, and as well as this filter, you can see it's fairly subtle in its approach. I like to add to this Pro Contrast, because that also gives me the opportunity, and if I just use the neutral option, there is by default no adjustment applied using the neutral option, but I sometimes see that there's a bit of a color cast creeps in, and if I slide this color cast correction slider across, sometimes it makes a little difference. In this image it makes virtually no difference, so I'm not going to use it. And by adding a little bit more dynamic contrast, you'll see that it just boosts the contrast just quite subtly. So with those selected, I'll apply those two filters, and that just gives me a little bit of a boost in those color areas with a bit of color contrast as well as tonal contrast. So with that applied, that's what we've got. We'll just minimize that menu, and as you can see, it's looking pretty good, but I'm not really enamored with how it's worked on the sky, so I want to eliminate the effect of this on the sky. So what I'm going to do now is select out the sky, and I'm going to use Photoshop's inbuilt filter to select the sky. Now in this case we've got a very hazy sky, so it may not work effectively, and it's done a reasonably good job, but I think I want to eliminate that Color Efex Pro filter from these hills in the distance. So using my quick selection tool, I'm going to add to that selection, and I'm just going to bring that down, and you'll see it overall does a pretty good job. It's missed a couple of areas here, so we just need to go to the minus option and bring those back in. Now I'm not going to completely eliminate the Color Efex Pro filter from the sky, but I'm going to minimize it. So I've now got a selection of the sky. I want the sky eliminated from the selection, so I'm going to select inverse. So I now have selected all of the foreground except the sky, and with that active on my Color Efex layer, I'm adding a mask, and now the effect is completely eliminated from the sky. I don't necessarily want that all eliminated, so with the mask active, I'm going to then use my density slider to bring back a little bit of that effect in the sky. Now once I get to about here, we start to see that haziness creep back in, so I'm going to just allow a little bit of that to come in. And using the density slider on your mask, you'll see if I overlay the mask, instead of being a black background with the density slider brought back, I'm bringing that mask into a sort of a grey tone, and that means that only part of that filter is being applied. So this is a great way to selectively apply a filter to an image, and I think that that's done a great job. It's just added a little bit of tonal contrast there, and I'm still looking at this bit of highlight area that I'm not 100% happy with. So there's another technique that we can apply to this, and that's called the recovery of the highlights. And to do this, we're going to use a selection tool under the select menu, color range, and counterintuitively amongst the color range options we have an option for highlights, midtones, or shadows. Now if you happen to have the Lumensia plugin, there's a much more effective way to make this selection, but because most people don't have that, I'm just going to use the highlight selection tool, and you'll see here with a range slider I can determine how much of this is going to be considered highlights. I really only want to target this part and a little bit of the top part of this iceberg you can see here, plus a couple of other areas. And so I have a range slider and the fuzziness slider, which determines how much either side of this range will be considered as part of the option. That looks good to me. I've now got a selection active that represents all of those highlight areas, and with that active I then select a curves layer, and by default I have my mask applied, but there's no effect because I haven't done anything with the curves. And what I'm going to do, instead of adjusting the curve, I'm merely going to change the blend mode, and on this I'm going to change it to multiply. Now you'll see here that it's actually gone way too strong and it's eliminated all of those lighter tones. So we've got two ways to control that. Firstly, we're going to drop the opacity back because it's way too strong. All I want to do is bring back a little bit of that detail in those highlight areas. But one of the other issues we have when we make a luminosity selection, and if I hold down the Alt key and click the mask, you'll see that it's made a very precise selection. And what happens at the edges, then you get a very sharp cutoff. So we don't want that. We want it to be blended in a little more effectively. So with our selection active, I can then use the feathering slider here to adjust that to the point where it starts to soften the edges. If I go too far, it goes very blurry, but somewhere in about here where I'm getting a little bit of softness, hold down the Alt key to go back to the image. It's still way too strong, so let's just go way back down, drop that opacity back until we are getting just bringing back some of that highlight detail. It can be quite subtle, but you'll see here that it's done that. So we're pretty close to being finished now. The image is looking much better, but I think it's now just lost a little bit of vibrance. So let's just look at a final curves adjustment layer, and I'm going to try the auto option because I've preset that to eliminate neutral tones. And if we hold down the Alt key and go into the auto settings, you'll see here that I'm trying to neutralize any color cast and snap to the neutral midtones, but I'm not happy with that result. It doesn't always work. It's now warmed it up too much. So let's just go back, reset that to default, and I'm going to instead just try a very slight contrast curve called the linear contrast curve, just to give it a little bit more punch. And I think now we're getting very close to the final image. So we're all but there with this image, and the last couple of things I'm going to look at is the foreground now looks to me to be just a little bit too dark. So I'm going to make a selection of that foreground and just lighten it slightly. And I'm not too happy with this little rock right on the edge. I think that's a bit of a distraction. So let's firstly look at our selection for the foreground. Again, using the quick selection tool, the plus option. Because this is fairly well defined, we should be able to make that selection pretty well. It's included those people that we previously selected. I don't really want those adjusted. I've already fixed those up, so let's just paint over that with the minus tool to eliminate them. Again, we're talking about fairly subtle adjustments here, so we don't need to be too fussy about being precise with it. We've now got that foreground selected. Let's move up to the top of our layer stack, create a new curves layer, and in this instance we're just going to lighten that a little bit. It can be quite subtle, but it's just often a lot of small adjustments make sense when we finalize the image. So I think that that's now balanced that up quite well. And our last little problem is this little area down here, that sort of lighter rock on the edge. I'm just going to go back down to my last full image layer, which is the Color Efex Pro layer, and make a quick selection with that using the lasso tool. And again, we'll go into edit, content aware fill. We're only doing a tiny little area of filling in. That looks perfectly acceptable to me. If I then deselect that area, you wouldn't know that it was there. So it's just done that beautifully well, and we've got that little area eliminated, and I can merge those two layers together if we want to save a bit of space. Merge those two layers together, and now we have an image that's really ready to go. And if we go back and compare where we started, if we hold down the Alt key, click on the base layer, it'll turn all of those layers off, and then if I click again, it turns them all back on. So you can see that it's made a dramatic difference, added a lot of contrast into the areas of the icebergs. We've brought out the color and the detail in the foreground. We've got rid of these two people here that were not wanted in the image, and we've made the image much more dramatic, and I think that that's ready to go to print. So I hope that's been useful, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.